Skidor's Prairie and Northern Region, podcast number 3, Winnipeg, St. Andrews. The St. Andrews Aerodrome is located in southeastern Manitoba, 10 nautical miles north of downtown Winnipeg. Runway 1331 is 3,000 feet long, runway 1836 is 3,004 feet long, and runway 0422 is 2,881 feet long. All 3 runways are asphalt and 75 feet wide. The aerodrome elevation is 760 feet. The circuit height is 1,600 feet, and runways 04, 13, and 18 are all right-hand circuits. The aerodrome is in a Class Delta control zone to 3,000 feet. It is served by a control tower during the day, and there is an ATF at other times. There are published VFR terminal procedures. In this episode, we have 3 reports occurring at St. Andrews to discuss. I'm Brad Crockett, a private pilot, single-engine land. Joining me is Praveen Premchandran, Chief Flight Instructor at Tyler Aviation. Welcome back, Praveen.
Hey, Brad. Good to be back again.
Our first report is Skidor's number 2013 C4811. NAV Canada, the Transportation Safety Board, and the Joint Rescue Coordination Centre, Trenton, report that on November 13th, 2013, at 1940 Zulu, the Skydive Manitoba Cessna 182F, registration Foxtrot Bravo India Yankee, was en route to St. Andrews from Gimli. On approach to St. Andrews, the engine began to run rough. The fuel gauges were checked, and the right gauge was on empty. The left gauge indicated the same level as found on startup. The left fuel tank was selected, but the rough running continued. The pilot attempted to reach the airfield, but had to force land on Donald Road, about 2.5 miles short of the airfield. During the landing flare, the left wingtip and propeller struck the road. The aircraft was kept on the road and remained upright. The wingtip was bent upwards, and the aileron was damaged. The pilot removed the fuel caps and found that no fuel had fed from the left tank, and the right tank was empty. There were no injuries. Prior to the start of the flight, the fuel tanks were dipped and showed that the fuel was equal in both tanks. The fuel selector was on both for the flight. That's the end of the report. Praveen, what do you think happened here?
Well, this seems to be like a classic case of fuel feeding from just the one tank. So it appears that the left tank was not providing the engine any fuel, and the aircraft was running on the entire flight solely on the right tank. The report does mention that at the start, the fuel was equal in both tanks, but it doesn't mention clearly how much was in the tanks, because Gimli to St. Andrews is a short hop of about 35 nautical miles. It shouldn't have really needed the pilot to have a lot of fuel in the airplane to make this a successful flight without running out of fuel.
What can pilots do to prevent this sort of problem?
Well, this might sound a little cliched, but proper pre-flight inspection, including fuel planning, would go a long ways. The pilot did mention that they checked both tanks by dipping the tanks. It said it had fuel and they were equal in both tanks. So in addition to this, what I would suggest for airplanes like high-wing Cessnas where there is a both position, checking the tanks individually on the ground before you take off, so running it on the separate tanks first before you set it to both, can help understand if there is a fuel blockage on one of the lines. Also checking if the primer is in and locked before you go flying, because if the primer is out, it could be providing more fuel to the engine than is required. But I was going through an older Cessna 182 POH, and it did mention that if the tanks are running then less than quarter, then the aircraft should be kept in both tanks, because there is a chance that fuel starvation might happen in prolonged uncoordinated flight while operating on a single tank.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this airplane was said to be operating on both tanks, but considering that the airplane didn't make a very short flight, I'm not very sure if there was a lot of fuel in both tanks, and also the fact that they weren't very clear as to how much fuel they started with. It just seems like the pilot took off with not enough fuel to make the flight. There's the old saying that there are three things that are useless to a pilot: fuel left on the ground, runway behind, and altitude above. Well, this appears that the pilot did not take enough fuel for the flight.
So you're saying even with both tanks running and feeding fuel properly, that the total fuel that the pilot took in this case was not adequate for having enough reserve fuel for the flight?
It would appear to be so, because considering that based on a rough calculation, that flight shouldn't have taken much longer than 15 minutes, and the pilot ran out of fuel with just the right tanks going empty. That would mean that if both tanks were at the same level during startup, the pilot probably didn't have enough to be legal in terms of a day VFR for reserve fuel.
Our second report is CDOR's number 2014 C0422. NAV Canada reports that at 15:52 Zulu on January 31st, 2014, a Harv's Air Service Cessna 172P, registration Golf Papa Tango Oscar, on a local flight from St. Andrews, experienced an engine stall on departure from a touch and go. The aircraft was disabled on runway 18 until 16:10 Zulu. The pilot had advanced the throttle too rapidly from idle to full power, and with the combination of the cold temperature on that day and being the first flight out for the day in cold weather, the Ep003 engine coughed and quit. The aircraft was brought back to the hangar and was checked for various things like the mixture setting and spark plugs, but nothing was found. It was released back into service and has been flying numerous times since with no further problems. That's the end of the report. What causes aircraft engines to respond like this?
Well, I looked up the temperature for the day and the time of the report. The reported temperature at Winnipeg International Airport, which is not too far from St. Andrews, at 10 a.m. was negative 29 degrees Celsius. If you've been outside when it's really cold and you try to breathe air when it's cold and thick like that, you will know very quickly how hard it is to breathe. Our aircraft engines are the same. They take air into the engine, and that's what they use to burn fuel. It does mention in the report that the throttle was advanced too rapidly. When you give it so much air in a short burst, there's not enough time for the fuel to vaporize, and you get too lean of a mixture, and that's probably what made the aircraft engine cough and then quit.
What should pilots do when it's time to add power?
The first thing I would suggest is what's already been mentioned in the report. The pilot advanced the throttle too rapidly. So on your touch and go landings, make sure you throttle up a little slower, especially when it's a cold day and the engine's still warming up. And also a little tip or trick, I could say, is leave the carburetor heat hot until after the throttle has been advanced fully. It helps in a couple ways. It keeps the engine ever so slightly warmer, and also it keeps the mixture slightly richer, and both of those can help, even at the very little, to prevent a happening like this. But the biggest takeaway I would say is, for a small piston aircraft like a 172, you really shouldn't be going out flying when it is very cold, because those engines are not really meant to fly at such cold temperatures. unlike turbine engines are. Another point to note is I know offhand that Harv's Air has a temperature rule where they don't go flying at negative 27 degrees Celsius. I'm surprised they were flying when it was colder than that.
Our final report is CADORS number 2015 C1328. NAV Canada reports that on April 16, 2015, at 2047 Zulu, a Cessna 208, registration Golf November Whiskey Golf, operating as Northway 832, was inbound to St. Andrews. The flight was cleared to land runway 26, with a Harv's Air Service Cessna 152, registration Foxtrot Bravo X-Ray Echo, on the runway. The 208 was then instructed to pull up and go around. That's the end of the report. They probably meant runway 36, not 26. Why would ATC clear an aircraft to land with traffic on the runway?
The report does not go into too much detail with regards to what the Cessna 152 was doing at that time. So I'm not sure if the airplane was arriving, departing, or on a touch and go. I can think of many scenarios as to why this happened, but I'm just going to say it was probably a simple miscalculation of the controller, thinking that the 152 would be clear by the time the Cessna 208 landed. It gets pretty busy at St. Andrews, so quite often you are given clearances a little in anticipation of how the traffic will move. Either way, air traffic control always has the option to cancel a clearance if it so determines that that would be in the interest of safety, and that appears to be what they did.
Why, if one of NAV Canada's controllers made a mistake, would they file a CADORS report?
Well, for starters, CADORS are just reports. They're not any admission of wrongdoing, or they're not insinuating any violation. It is just a report, as the R from the acronym suggests. It is just standard protocol for a CADORS to be filed when anything that is non-standard that happens. Now, there is a column further down in the CADORS report that usually states whether follow-up or further action is required. And in this particular case, it says a no, which just means that it was just a simple learning from either a controller error or just some issue of timing.
What are the consequences of a pilot submitting a CADORS report where the pilot may be at fault?
That is a good point that you raised there, Brad. It's always good to file a CADOR, whether you're a controller or a pilot. This is at the very least so that everybody can learn from what happened. Of course, if something is more serious, there will be follow-up action. But at the end of the day, it's important that we admit a mistake and we try to learn from this. As pilots, we should always try to learn from the mistakes of others, and a CADOR is just one of those learning tools that we can use to learn and become better pilots, better controllers, and better aviators all around. There is an interesting article on the BC Aviation website, which will be linked in the show notes of this podcast.
Yeah, that's a good article. I have read that one, and it's on our Facebook page too. Thanks. That's it for this episode. Subscribe to the podcast in iTunes, SoundCloud, or TuneIn Radio. You can reach the podcast by email at podcast@cadors.ca. Praveen, how can people best reach you?
You can reach me via email. That's praveen@tylair.com, tylair.com.
Praveen, I really appreciate this. Thanks for joining us again.
It's good to be here, Brad, and hopefully we all learn together from our mistakes.
And thank you for listening as we exercise our license to learn. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided is done at your own risk. This podcast should not be considered professional advice. If you have a question about an aviation occurrence reported in Cadores, send an email to podcast@cadores.ca.